It was 1999. The Star Wars craze was at a fever pitch. As the summer drew closer, more media outlets were covering what was promising to be the movie event of the century. People were missing work to camp outside of theaters for months in advance, desperate to be among the first to see a brand new Star Wars film. Other summer movies were bowing their heads at it.
If you see only one movie this summer, see Star Wars.
Collectors were going out grabbing toys like they were the cure for cancer. It was the first time I was experiencing the Star Wars phenomenon firsthand, something I heard about but was just too young to experience the first time around. There had never been any movie that generated this much buzz. There is no way one movie was ever going to meet such high expectations. I was 16, and it was the perfect time to be a Star Wars fan. Like everyone else, I bought into the hype. I didn't run out to grab the toys, but I made sure to clear room on my calendar so I could be one of the first ones to experience it. My uncle and I went to wait in line for 3 hours the night of that first midnight screening. The anticipation was agonizing as the starting time got closer. And finally, the lights dimmed, the 20th Century Fox logo appeared, and we saw those all too familiar words, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." Then the crawl started. Everyone went nuts. We were finally seeing a new Star Wars film, the first one in 16 years. I can't speak for everyone, but I can tell you what my experience was like. Sitting there in the theater, watching this new adventure unfold, was intoxicating. Half the time I wasn't even focusing on the story. I was just in disbelief that I was actually sitting there, watching the first of Lucas's prequel trilogy. I wasn't nitpicking or analyzing what I was seeing. I was taking in the visuals, the new ships and planets, the introductions of familiar characters, trying to work out if Senator Palpatine and Darth Sidious were the same person. I was actually impressed by how seamlessly Jar Jar Binks interacted with the live-action characters. Yeah, some of the scenes with Jake Lloyd were a little annoying.
We hit R2!
But at that point, I was already so mesmerized by the experience that it didn't faze me at all. By the time the credits rolled, I was on cloud 9. I wanted to sit there and watch it again and again. I had just witnessed the beginning of the entire Star Wars saga, and despite having to wait for the next 2 films to fill in the gaps, I felt like I'd already been filled in on so much. My brain exploded. I went to school the next day and told everyone about the experience, telling everyone that they had to go experience it for themselves and that it was amazing. I even went to see the film 2 more times that week. Not once did I say to myself, maybe this isn't as good as I thought it was. I'll be honest with you, and again, I'm only speaking for myself, but the film met my expectations. Despite all the hype, all the media buzz, all the marketing, I never once thought, hey, this movie might actually suck.
This is very, very bad. Oh, this is cool.
But I was waiting for this movie ever since I found out that the original film was titled Episode 4. When Lucas announced that he was finally going to start work on the prequels, I tried to find out anything I could about them. Finally, I picked up an issue of Star Wars Insider, which was promising our first behind-the-scenes glimpse of Episode 1. This was probably right after the special editions came out, and sure enough, there it was. On-set photos of sets being built, costumes, very little to go on, but just enough to whet my appetite. This was before that initial teaser trailer launched, so we still had no idea what the story was going to be. But based on some interesting interviews with Lucas himself, we knew a few things. First of all, this wasn't going to be the early adventures of Luke Skywalker. These new movies were going to be all about Anakin Skywalker, how he fell from grace and was seduced to the dark side. We were going to learn about his relationship to Obi-Wan, his significance to the Jedi Council, his friendship with Senator Palpatine, his wife, and ultimately how Luke and Leia were born, which Lucas was pretty sure would happen toward the end of the 3rd film. These were all things Lucas confirmed. He also gave some specifics about the first film, which at that time was just being called Episode 1, The Beginning. He said that it was going to be a very different looking film with elegant costumes and sophisticated technology that would serve as a stark contrast to the small scale and gritty landscapes of the original film. We would finally see what the Galactic Senate looked like, as well as the Galactic Capital, which would become Coruscant. Lucas was also interested in pushing the boundaries of special effects. He was talking about the fact that the first movie would be a 95% digital film. If you talk to Star Wars fans today, it seems that one of their biggest gripes is just how much reliability there was on digital effects in those prequels. But back in the 90s, CGI was still coming into its own. It seemed that ever since Jurassic Park came out, CGI just wasn't reaching its full potential, and filmmakers were starting to use it as a gimmick to sell tickets. But for Lucas, who had always been frustrated by how limited technology was interested in telling a story where there were no creative boundaries. Whether you like Jar Jar or flat out loathed him, you couldn't have created a creature who was that animated back in the 80s. Even something as innovative as Yoda, who captivated audiences by his realistic performance, was severely limited by the restrictions of the technology. You could never have gotten a fight scene with that character using old school puppeteering techniques. So I could definitely tell what Lucas was trying to get across. Digital technology in many ways freed him up creatively, allowing him to tell any story he wanted without having to worry about sacrificing his vision because he couldn't figure out how to pull it off. It wasn't perfect. Going back to A New Hope, as most of you know, Lucas later included the famous scene where Han confronts Jabba the Hutt outside of the Millennium Falcon. When they digitally added Jabba to the scene, the animators had a little difficulty because this new version of Jabba had a tail. When Harrison Ford walks around the actor, there was this weird effect where it looked like Han was moving through Jabba. So once again, Lucas had to compromise, and the end result was that Han steps on Jabba's tail. It looked convincing, it solved the technical problem, and ultimately it was something that Han would do anyway. There were similar problems in The Phantom Menace. The character of Watto is portrayed as a crotchety old junk dealer with one solitary tooth, but originally, the character was conceived as a younger character. There was some sort of issue where the animators couldn't get the character to close his mouth properly when saying certain words, so they figured out that by giving him one broken tooth, they could get the reaction they needed. So digital technology still couldn't solve every problem, but there were definitely creative workarounds, and ultimately, Lucas got a film that was much closer to his original vision than he could ever get before. I think the general consensus with these movies, and this one in particular, is that Lucas spent more attention on the digital effects than he did on the story, and that's why a lot of the film feels unfocused.
A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing.
It does what it set out to do, which was to explore the beginnings of these characters, setting up the next 5 films. But as a standalone film, it's kind of a mess. Going back to A New Hope for the umpteenth billionth time, when Lucas made that movie, he didn't know he was going to be able to make sequels, so it had to be its own film. There is no cliffhanger. It ends on a really upbeat note. It wasn't until The Empire Strikes Back when we really got to delve into the mythology and we were let in on the relationships between these characters. Imagine it's 1977 and all you have is that first movie. No one would have ever expected that Darth Vader was connected to Luke Skywalker. He was just a really cool villain. With The Phantom Menace, it was a little different, because its job was to go back in time and fill in the story gaps. While I feel that it does that, we're introduced to Anakin Skywalker, we see how the Jedi Council works, how the Senate works, and ultimately we see the beginning of Palpatine's rise to power, the overall story of The Phantom Menace is kind of confusing. There's so much going on between the Trade Federation taking over Naboo, the reappearance of the Sith, the Jedi trying to figure out what to do with Anakin, not to mention the introduction of midichlorians, the conflict between the people of Naboo and the Gungans, and the fact that this whole time the person we thought was the Queen was actually a decoy. Whoa. Someone should have probably gone back and written a few more drafts. When these movies were coming out, I was taken aback by just how much was going on. I never expected to actually see the Clone Wars and to go so in-depth into all the politics. Some of that stuff worked great, but the older I got, the more I realized that what made those original movies work was their overall simplicity. Despite everything we see in those original films, they're easy to follow because there's a clear destination, and I think that's what films do best. Today you have all these studios trying to create cinematic universes where they make one movie that tries to set up the next 5. Sometimes they're successful, but come on, more often than not it just doesn't work. Audiences can only follow so much story in the span of 2 hours. Television has evolved so much over the years. That's the perfect medium for telling a really expansive story. As far as movies go, the simpler the better. Sure, there hasn't been any other film series that's attempted to tell one story over so many movies. Usually with a franchise this big, each installment is its own thing, but with Star Wars, we keep showing up to the next one because we want to know what's going to happen next to these characters. With The Phantom Menace, I've realized that it has its problems. The performances are kind of wooden, the dialogue isn't very memorable, and the story could have been more streamlined. But I think mainly the problem is that Lucas was so excited about being able to create whatever he wanted that he couldn't distill his ideas down into something more manageable. All that stuff that happens over the course of The Phantom Menace could have been stretched out into the next 2 films. What a lot of people don't realize, and something that never seems to come up, is that ultimately the major conflict in that movie is that the villains are creating genocide. By blocking all trade routes to Naboo, the Trade Federation is forcing these people to starve to death. While the Queen is away watching pod races and debating things in the Senate, her people are being led away to concentration camps.
Commander,
Yes, sir.
process them.
Captain, take them to Camp 4. Roger, roger.
This should have been the focus of the movie, but we're so busy focusing on how Anakin is going to leave Tatooine, how he meets Obi-Wan, how Palpatine fits into this, how the Sith factor into everything, how the Jedi factor into everything. We never get to sit back and focus on the film's central conflict. Now, I'm not hating on this movie. I still enjoy watching it from time to time. It's ultimately a fun movie. I've seen worse. But I've also come to terms with the idea that just because we admire someone's work doesn't make them infallible. I think we all have artists that we love who at one point or another have come out with something that was less than perfect. The Phantom Menace is just one of those things. It showed a lot of promise, it was the subject of a lot of hype, and over time, fans went overboard with their hatred of it. Personally, I just think Lucas should have spent a little more time trimming the fat and making it a little more focused. And I think as these movies continued to come out, Lucas learned from his mistakes and improved on them.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Or did he?